Ken Cuccinelli is the acting director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, kind enough to stop by. You were in town. What were you up to?
Really just visiting with our Denver office that's been performing very well in the last couple of years. And we have offices, 88 of them all across the country, and 20 more around the world. That's shrinking down to 7 soon. But you know, everything we do isn't about the border. It's also about interacting with the communities around the country. And helping process immigration petitions over about 9 million a year. So we stay busy all over the country.
You have been doing a lot of work getting ready for the new public charge rule that the administration has made for, I think October 15th is the deadline, which is next Tuesday.
Date, yes.
What's the intention of that rule?
Summed up, the purpose of the public charge rule is a regulation to implement a law passed in 1996, signed by Bill Clinton, that continues the 140-year federal legal tradition of requiring self-sufficiency by those who seek to be here as long-term immigrants or eventually perhaps become citizens. So self-sufficiency requirement and giving us ways to actually implement that for our officers who have to decide these cases one at a time.
That rule is facing court challenges across the country. Why is it worth the fight?
Well, I will say you can't really measure on court challenges. Everything we do, we get sued over. It's become a part of the how policy is implemented. It's run through the filter of the court. So it's not really a measure of the policy. Everything this administration has done has been within the boundaries of the law, and you've seen that as court cases go up. Once they get high enough up the court chain, the president wins these things, and it's because he's determined, and he tells us this, to stay within the boundaries of the law and to use the authority we have, but always in restrained ways that are consistent with the law. And that did not happen in the last administration. And so that's a major change. So we're confident that we'll win these lawsuits. And we also don't weigh it as a reason not to do something. Because again, Steve, we start with this assumption we're always going to be sued. So if you just shied away from improving the American immigration system just because you'd be sued, we would never do anything.
So we recently did a story here about health care and child health care. The state reported about 20,000 kids additionally added to this list. I think it's 54,000 who don't have health care. We've heard from families who are concerned about having their kids on Medicaid because of the impact of this new rule and what it might do to their immigration status. Is that the intention of this?
I'm really glad you asked about that, because one of the changes made in the final rule based on public comments was to exclude exactly the kind of children you describe from coverage by the rule. So Medicaid for children and for those under 21 and pregnant women, including after birth for a period of time, that's not covered. There are a lot of things that don't get swept into the public charge regulation and the requirement for self-sufficiency. For adults, health care would matter, but not for children.
Would you agree, though, that this creates fear?
No. No.
Why is that?
This is the tradition of requiring self-sufficiency among those immigrating to the United States is actually older than the United States. You can trace it all the way back to 1645 in Massachusetts. It's been part of federal law as long as we've had meaningful immigration law, and thousands and thousands of people have in fact been turned back over the history of our immigration system for not meeting the public charge requirements at that time. So this is not new by any means. It is in the news because the regulation has passed. The reason for the regulation is in the Clinton administration, they put out a memorandum and said, this memorandum will be what governs this until a rule comes out. Well, the idea was that they would put a rule out. They never did. The Bush administration didn't do it. The Obama administration didn't do it. So here we are 20 years later, actually putting the rules in place to enforce the law passed by Congress, and I should say, Steve, on a wildly bipartisan basis. I mean, it was so uncontroversial that it passed through the U.S. Senate on a voice vote. And a lot of the people who you see perhaps complaining about the Trump administration in the immigration space, people like Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, they all voted for this. So, there was a time when maintaining core values like self-sufficiency in immigration law was just plain old common sense. Unfortunately, a lot of immigration as a rhetorical matter has become politicized, and it doesn't necessarily contribute to a great discussion.
Would you argue that the president has politicized it?
The president is a tough talker. There's no question about it. You look at the border, though, and his hard-nosed approach to Mexico and the Northern Triangle countries has now resulted in some of the best partnerships on the ground that we've seen from those countries in yours and my adult lifetime. I mean, it has had very positive benefits. So it has its place. I fully recognize that the sort of the public arena around issues like immigration has become very tough from a rhetorical standpoint. I mean, I take those punches and I try to, educate. It's why I appreciate being here. And a question like your Medicaid question, it's important for people to know not just what is covered, but what's not covered.
We appreciate you being here. I want to go back to a question you've been asked before. The quote is, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." The poem goes on from there. A lot of people have questioned whether this rule contradicts that poem on the Statue of Liberty.
Well,
does it?
We write law, not poetry. We enforce law, not poetry. So what this regulation does is enforce the 1996 law that Bill Clinton signed, passed on, as I said, a wildly bipartisan basis. And that's all we have to go on. Some reporters, ask questions about that poem, and people can have their opinions about it, but that isn't what we enforce, and it isn't what we look to for guidance.
And I do want to go back to something that was a story after that question was initially asked. You asserted that this poem wasn't was actually intended for European immigrants. Do you still feel that way?
It isn't a question of what I feel. Back 100 years ago, immigration happened largely by boat. Now we've got a land issue coming across our southern border. And from Europe, that largely showed up in New York, was the main port of entry. From Asia and points west, San Francisco would have been sort of your equivalent. So that was just at the time, the early 1900s, when that poem went on the statue. It wasn't part of the statue. It was added in 1903. It was part of a private fundraiser, good old American fundraising. And that's just who it was directed to. So it has no relevance for the regulation. It has no relevance for the law. I don't sit here as a historian of poem plaques around the United States of America.
Apprehensions at the border are down. We just heard that from the department earlier
yes,
this
Mark Morgan,
week.
head of CBP, announced that recently.
How does that compare? Do you know the numbers of apprehensions in Colorado?
Yes. Well, I don't know. I don't know it state by state. But the September numbers were just over 50,000, which is down off the incredible peak in May of 144,000. And these are apprehensions, and those turned back at points of entry. This doesn't account for people not caught crossing illegally. So, people should keep that in mind. It is not the total traffic across the border, the illegal traffic across the border, but these are incredible numbers. And even as far down as September is from May, those are still crisis numbers. That's over 600,000 illegal crossings a year if it were on an annual basis. And we do not have an immigration system built for this. Congress has not seen fit, even during this entire crisis, to do anything but complain. By and large, they have done nothing. For instance, they complain about overcrowding at detention facilities. Well, they should build more detention facilities. That comes out of the legislature, the Congress, and their appropriations to provide what facilities are available. So it is a little bit disingenuous of a lot of the people in Congress to make complaints about things that are their responsibility to fix. In the Department of Homeland Security, you have seen each agency, mine, USCIS, ICE, Customs and Border Protection, Border Patrol is part of that, all extend themselves way beyond ordinary job descriptions to try to meet this crisis. And we're still doing that, and again, not like May, thankfully, but we're still at crisis level numbers. We really need Congress to legislate to close off some of the inappropriate attractions for people to come here illegally. And I would note several of the things we've been asking for, the Obama administration was asking for as well, and they still haven't happened. So it's not like I'm pointing at one side or the other. This is a congressional failure of a bipartisan nature.
I know this isn't necessarily the purview of your agency, but you're a voice in the room, so I feel like I can ask you this. You're sitting in Denver, which has been deemed a sanctuary city by the president.
Well, by them. I mean, I've listened to
by
some
Denver.
of them. Yes,
yes.
quite
Sure.
proudly.
Why should it be the purview of local law enforcement to enforce federal immigration law?
Well, that isn't really what happens. It isn't. You aren't enforcing federal immigration law if you notify ICE that you're holding a criminal who has been deemed after a long due process period to be a removable alien from the United States because they're here illegally. I would flip the question a little bit and ask, how many times in American history can you think of where state, local, and federal law enforcement didn't set politics aside and work together to support one another? And sadly, I can only think of one, and it was not a positive period in our history. And it was the Civil Rights era. And that is the only example I can think of where politics really invaded law enforcement in the way we're seeing today. That was a sad chapter for state and local law enforcement and their behavior in that respect. And here we have sanctuary cities who are willing to sacrifice the safety of their own citizens and defy the established law of the United States to basically send political virtue signals. Denver is less safe because of these policies. It's inarguable. If you have criminals who could be removed from your community, and legally ought to be, and instead you release them back into the community, and in Denver, if I understand correctly, they don't even, it's just personal recognizance bonds for most everything. So that means they cycle right back out into the community, and they're right there to prey on the community. And a lot of what I hear from sanctuary cities is, oh, we're protecting thus and such community. Let's, because of the situation of the border, we'll say, we'll talk about the Hispanic community. My experience, I worked on criminal justice reform for many, many years. I know the data shows that if you have a particular criminal, white, black, Hispanic, Asian, the odds are overwhelming that their victim is of their same race, ethnicity. Criminals overwhelmingly victimize their own communities. So it cannot be said that by blocking ICE, because that's what Denver's doing, from removing criminals, because those are the people at stake for sanctuary cities, is removing criminals, that Denver is anything other than less safe.
But do you understand the argument of local law enforcement saying the courts have ruled that we can't necessarily hold on to people beyond what we've arrested them for?
That's simply just not true. I mean, the federal law is very clear, and these are legal orders issued by administrative law judges. And let's take the premise as true, though. They know when they're releasing them. All they have to do is notify ICE 48 hours in advance of when the release is. Then you don't even run into the issue you describe. Instead, they are actively coming right up to the line of assisting people in being fugitives from federal justice.
How does the administration crack down on that?
Well, it is a challenge because there's lots of elements of government. There's transportation, there's law enforcement, there's commerce and business and regulation. And do you really want one to invade the others? But unfortunately, we're being pushed in those directions by cities like Denver, where we have to use as many tools as we have available instead of just dealing with them head up on law enforcement issues.
What's your message to Mayor Hancock, who is one of the supporters of this?
Well, stop sacrificing the safety of the people of Denver and at least notify the people at ICE when criminals are going to be released. And in Denver, that virtually means after they're caught, because they overwhelmingly get personal recognizance bonds here. And what that means for your viewers is they don't pay any money to be let out of jail. And needless to say, lots of them just leave the area rather than face even state and local justice because of that process. So they're gone. And particularly those who also have detainers because they've been through the due process of obtaining a removal order. That's one more reason for them to abscond from Denver justice. And so you get your one shot when they're arrested for, sexually assaulting a child. I use examples that are real from around the country. Rape, murder, all of it. And those are the people being released. And I would think if you ask individual Denver citizens and you strip the politics away and just ask questions like, if the Denver police catch a murderer and he gets to leave jail awaiting trial, but he could also be removed from the country because he's an illegal alien, would you like him out? Overwhelmingly, even those who are overwhelmingly on the left would say, well, yes, particularly if it was their community being victimized.
The argument we're hearing from a lot of prosecutors and from the police is the culture of fear that we were talking about, is stopping some victims from coming to court to testify to put these people actually behind bars.
Look, I was a state attorney general. I talked to a police officer locally here as recently as yesterday, and he brought up this exact issue, and he says it's completely false. And he's working the Denver streets. So that's local intel. And that's not an uncommon comment. It's a political excuse used by people who want to, use what has become, unfortunately, a political club on the left in particular, rather than confront the real consequences, the public safety consequences, which are tragic and sad, of policies like this.
You've been in the job now for a few months. I got to ask you, what's the most challenging part of being in this role at this time in this country?
Well, immigration is very sensitive for very good reasons. It's a big part of America's history, and it's also a big problem we face at the same time. So on the legal side, there's so much history and so much positive we do. I'll tell you, there's nothing more moving for me than participating in the citizenship ceremonies, which is the highest privilege we grant in our agency and maybe much of the federal government. And if, for your viewers who've never been to one of those ceremonies, they really ought to go. People who've grown up here and were born American citizens, it really takes you back to say, wow, there's a lot I've been taking for granted. We really are the greatest country in the world. We're not perfect, and we'll never be perfect. And we'll keep debating all the things that aren't perfect about us. But we're the best that has ever been as a nation. And it is a real blessing to be an American citizen. And so working through that process is a huge benefit of my job. And people who are following the law and doing it the right way and joining us as Americans. On the other side, it is frustrating to see the massive numbers of people clearly and overtly gaming the system, no problem coming illegally, and counting on the kind of left-wing allies we described to keep the system broken down and to tie up the courts, to essentially let them leak through the net, where these other people are following the rules, they see no need to. And that is frustrating. Our conversation about Congress's inactivity, where they could solve a lot of this very quickly if they chose to do so and don't do it. It's frustrating to see the solution is sitting there, or part of the solution, there's no one silver bullet, and that it not be acted on.
Ken Cuccinelli, thank you so much for the conversation.
My pleasure, good to be with you.
I appreciate it.
Subscribe to the Next YouTube channel for the best of Next and some other stuff.